Modern battlefield no longer begins with the sound of artillery or the movement of armored columns. In today's world, conflict often starts quietly inside trade agreements, behind diplomatic statements, buried in economic clauses that rarely make headlines until the damage is already underway. And right now, one such conflict is unfolding across North America, where trade lines are being redrawn, not with ink, but with pressure, leverage, and strategic intent. At the center of this confrontation stands Canada's aluminium industry, one of the most critical yet underestimated pillars of the global supply chain. For decades, Canadian aluminum has flowed south into the United States, powering everything from military aircraft to electricity, being tested in ways that could permanently reshape the economic balance between the two neighbors. What appears on the surface as a routine trade disagreement is, in reality, something far more consequential. It is a stress test of sovereignty, economic independence, and political resolve. And this time, Canada is not quietly complying. According to verified international economic reporting, Washington has recently intensified its demands on Canadian aluminum exports, framing them as necessary for domestic industry protection and national security. But behind those words lies a deeper strategy: leverage. The United States, facing its own industrial bottlenecks and political pressures, is attempting to reassert control over supply chains that it no longer fully commands. Canada, however, is pushing back. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a calculated response, one that signals a broader shift in how middle powers navigate economic pressure from larger allies. And when Canadian leadership, backed by industrial stakeholders and labor unions, draws a firm line, it sends a message that echoes far beyond aluminum smelters and trade offices. Because this is not just about metal, this is about power. To understand why this moment matters, we must step back and examine how aluminium became a strategic asset in the first place. Unlike steel, aluminium production is energy intensive. It requires stable electricity, long-term infrastructure investment, and environmental regulation compliance. Canada, with its vast hydroelectric resources, quietly became one of the world's most efficient and reliable producers. Over time, American manufacturers came to depend on that reliability, not as an option, but as a necessity. Yet dependence creates vulnerability. And in times of political uncertainty, vulnerability invites pressure. Recent statements from U.S. officials, cited by multiple international outlets, suggest that Washington views foreign aluminum, even from allies, as a potential risk. The language has shifted. Which hand, day, Toptic, when side yet side, U.S. speaking, what was once trade cooperation is now being framed as strategic exposure. That shift alone tells us everything we need to know about the mindset driving current policy. But Canada's response has disrupted expectations. Rather than conceding quietly or seeking behind-the-scenes compromises, Canadian leadership has openly resisted key U.S. demands. This resistance is not emotional, it is methodical. It is rooted in data, supply chain realities, and long-term national interest. And it marks a turning point in how Canada positions itself on the global economic chessboard. According to analysts familiar with the negotiations, Canadian officials are increasingly unwilling to accept conditions that undermine domestic industry stability. Redirecting exports, diversifying trade partners, and reinforcing internal supply resilience are no longer abstract concepts, they are active strategies now being deployed. This is where the story becomes larger than Canada and the United States, because similar dynamics are unfolding worldwide. From Europe to East Asia, nations are reassessing economic dependencies that once seemed safe. Trade, once marketed as neutral and apolitical, has become a tool of influence and sometimes coercion. In this environment, every export decision becomes a geopolitical signal. Canada's pushback, therefore, is being closely watched. Not just by Washington, but by other U.S. allies who quietly ask the same question: how much pressure is too much? And more importantly, what happens when an ally says no? The implications are significant. A successful Canadian stand could embolden other resource exporting nations to renegotiate terms long considered non-negotiable. It could accelerate the fragmentation of traditional trade blocs. And it could force the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality: that economic dominance no longer guarantees compliance. Meanwhile, the political stakes continue to rise. Domestic pressure inside both countries is intensifying. In the United States, industrial groups demand protection and reshoring. In Canada, labor unions and provincial governments warn against surrendering strategic industries. These internal forces are now colliding at the international level, turning what might have been a technical dispute into a political confrontation. And then there is timing. This conflict unfolds at a moment when global markets are already unstable. Supply chains remain fragile. Energy costs fluctuate. Military-industrial demand is rising worldwide. Any disruption, even a partial one, can trigger ripple effects that reach far beyond North America. That is why this moment cannot be dismissed as routine. What we are witnessing is the early stage of a broader economic recalibration, one where alliances are tested not by ideology, but by material interests. And as Canada redraws its trade lines, the consequences will extend into boardrooms, factories, and policy chambers across the globe. But the most critical question remains unanswered. What happens next? Does Washington escalate? Does Canada redirect exports permanently? Does this dispute quietly resolve? Or does it set a precedent that reshapes future trade relations? Those answers are beginning to take shape behind closed doors, in negotiations marked by tension, calculation, and strategic silence. And as the pressure builds, one thing is already clear. This is no longer just a trade disagreement. It is a signal that the era of unquestioned economic alignment is fading, and a new phase of strategic resistance is emerging. To understand why this confrontation reached a breaking point, we have to move beyond press statements and public diplomacy and into the quieter spaces where economic power is actually exercised. Behind closed doors, far from cameras and podiums, this dispute did not emerge overnight. It built slowly, through a series of calculated demands, shifting expectations, and strategic assumptions that Canada would ultimately comply, as it had so many times before. For years, the United States has relied on a familiar playbook. When domestic industries face pressure from rising costs, political backlash, or electoral cycles, Washington looks outward. Tariffs, quotas, and temporary safeguards become tools to signal strength at home, even when they strain relationships abroad. Allies are often the easiest targets, precisely because they are expected to absorb pressure quietly in the name of partnership. Canada was no exception. According to reporting from multiple verified international economic outlets, U.S. trade officials began pushing for tighter controls on Canadian aluminium exports under the justification of market stabilization. The language was technical, almost bureaucratic, but the intent was clear: limit volume, influence pricing, and ensure American manufacturers gain leverage in a sector where they have struggled to remain competitive. Initially, the pressure was subtle: requests for data, proposals for voluntary adjustments. But when those approaches failed to produce the desired outcome, the tone hardened. What followed was a demand that crossed a critical threshold. Sources familiar with the negotiations indicate that U.S. representatives sought commitments that would effectively bind Canada's aluminium sector to American domestic priorities, even during periods of global shortage or price fluctuation. In other words, Canada would shoulder the risk while the United States secured the benefit. For Canadian policymakers, this was no longer a trade discussion. It was a sovereignty issue. Canada's aluminium industry is not just an export machine. It supports tens of thousands of jobs, anchors regional economies, and represents decades of investment in clean energy infrastructure. To accept unilateral constraints would mean exposing Canadian workers and producers to volatility they did not create, all while surrendering strategic autonomy. This is where the pushback began. Rather than negotiating concessions, Canadian officials shifted the framework of the discussion entirely. They reframed aluminium not as a commodity to be managed by foreign demand, but as a national strategic asset. This shift was decisive. It signaled that future negotiations would be governed by long-term national interest, not short-term diplomatic convenience. According to analysts observing the talks, this recalibration caught Washington off guard. The assumption had been that Canada, faced with economic pressure from its largest trading partner, would seek compromise at almost any cost. Instead, Ottawa made it clear that certain lines would not be crossed, even if that meant absorbing political friction or economic retaliation. Behind the scenes, contingency planning accelerated. Canadian trade officials quietly began exploring alternative export routes, strengthening ties with European and Asian markets, and assessing domestic capacity adjustments. These were not symbolic gestures. They were operational preparations designed to reduce exposure to U.S. leverage. At the same time, messaging hardened. Public statements emphasized fair trade, mutual respect, and supply chain resilience. But beneath those phrases lay a warning. Canada would no longer accept asymmetric arrangements that prioritize American political cycles over Canadian economic stability. This shift resonated beyond government circles. Industry leaders, labor unions, and provincial authorities aligned behind the federal position with unusual unity. In a country often divided by regional interests, aluminium became a rare point of consensus. The message was blunt. Surrendering control now would weaken Canada's position for decades. The United States, meanwhile, faced its own internal contradictions. American manufacturers depend heavily on Canadian aluminium. Defense contractors, automotive producers, and renewable energy firms rely on its consistency and quality. Any disruption, even a partial one, would ripple through supply chains already strained by global instability. Yet political pressure at home demanded action. This tension between economic reality and political optics has defined much of Washington's recent trade behavior. And in this case, it produced a strategy that attempted to extract concessions without triggering visible backlash. But Canada's resistance disrupted that calculation. Instead of quietly adjusting exports, Canada forced the issue into the open. The dispute became public, markets took notice, analysts began speculating about long-term consequences, and suddenly, what was meant to be a controlled negotiation evolved into a visible test of influence. This is where the geopolitical dimension becomes unavoidable. Trade disputes among allies send signals far beyond the parties involved. They are watched closely by competitors, rivals, and emerging powers who study how pressure is applied and how it is resisted. Canada's stance, therefore, carries implications not only for North America, but for the global order of economic alignment. If a close USS ally can successfully push back, others may follow. That prospect unsettles long-standing assumptions about American leverage. It suggests that influence is no longer automatic, that it must be negotiated, justified, and sometimes conceded. Meanwhile, the economic clock is ticking. Global demand for aluminium continues to rise, driven by electrification, defense expansion, and infrastructure investment. Supply constraints are tightening. Energy costs remain volatile. In this environment, even minor disruptions can amplify into major shocks. Canada's decision to resist U.S. demands introduces uncertainty, but also opportunity. By diversifying trade and asserting control, Canada positions itself as a more independent actor in a fragmented global market. The United States now faces a dilemma. Escalation risks damaging its own industries. Retaliation could push Canada closer to alternative partners. Accommodation, on the other hand, would signal limits to U.S. economic pressure, a message Washington is reluctant to broadcast. And so, the standoff continues. Quiet negotiations persist. Public rhetoric remains measured. But beneath the surface, strategic recalculations are underway on both sides of the border. This is no longer about aluminium alone. It is about how power is exercised in an era where economic tools have replaced military force as the primary instrument of influence. It is about how alliances adapt when interests diverge. And it is about whether resistance, even from a close partner, can redefine the balance. As the next phase unfolds, the consequences will become clearer. What is unfolding between Canada and the United States is not an isolated episode. It is part of a much larger transformation taking place across the global system, one where trade, security, and political power have become inseparably linked. To grasp the true weight of this moment, we must widen the lens beyond North America and examine the pattern emerging worldwide. Over the last decade, economic interdependence was once celebrated as a stabilizing force. The assumption was simple: nations that trade together do not fight each other. Supply chains were globalized. Production was optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Governments outsourced strategic capacity to markets, believing access would always be guaranteed. That assumption no longer holds. From Eastern Europe to the Indo-Pacific, recent crises have revealed the fragility of that model. Energy, food, semiconductors, rare earths, and now industrial metals all have become pressure points. Control over supply is no longer just an economic advantage, it is a strategic weapon. Aluminium sits squarely within that category. It is essential to modern warfare, aerospace engineering, renewable energy infrastructure, transportation, and communications. Any nation capable of producing it at scale, sustainably and reliably, holds leverage. Canada is one such nation, and that reality fundamentally alters its position in the global hierarchy. What we are witnessing now is Canada asserting that leverage. This assertion places the country at the center of a broader recalibration, where middle powers are no longer content to be passive suppliers within systems dominated by larger states. Instead, they are redefining their role, demanding reciprocity, predictability, and respect for domestic priorities. According to international political economists, this shift reflects a deeper structural change. Power is diffusing. No single country can fully control the flows of materials, capital, or technology anymore, and when control erodes, negotiation replaces dominance. The United States is encountering this reality repeatedly. In Europe, allies have resisted certain security and energy demands. In Asia, partners hedge their alignment, balancing US's ties with regional interests. And now, in North America itself, Canada is signaling that alignment does not equal submission. This moment carries symbolic weight. Canada has long been viewed as Washington's most dependable economic partner, predictable, cooperative, and aligned. A firm pushback from Ottawa challenges that perception and forces a reassessment of how influence is exercised among allies. But this resistance is not driven by ideology. When as they hayest, D-A-N-D, team tidy, it is driven by calculation. Canadian policymakers understand that the future will be defined by scarcity and competition. As demand for strategic materials accelerates, those who control supply will shape outcomes. Relinquishing that control today would weaken Canada's bargaining position tomorrow, not only with the United States, but with every future partner. This logic is reshaping national strategies worldwide. Countries once reluctant to politicize trade are now doing so openly. Export controls, industrial subsidies, and domestic production mandates are becoming normalized. The language of free trade remains, but the practice has shifted toward managed competition. Canada's stance fits squarely within this new reality. By refusing to accept unilateral constraints, Canada aligns itself with a growing group of states seeking to insulate critical industries from external pressure. This does not mean abandoning alliances. It means redefining their terms. The implications for the United States are profound. For decades, American economic leadership rested on the assumption that allies would prioritize access to U.S. markets above all else. That assumption is eroding. Market access still matters, but so does autonomy. And when those interests collide, autonomy is gaining ground. This creates a strategic dilemma. If Washington escalates pressure, it risks accelerating fragmentation. Allies may diversify away from U.S. dependence than anticipated. If Washington retreats, it sets a precedent that resistance works, a message competitors would welcome. Either path carries costs. Meanwhile, markets are already responding. Analysts track shifts in aluminium pricing, investment flows, and long-term contracts. Companies reassess sourcing strategies. Investors weigh political risk more heavily than before. These adjustments happen quietly, but their cumulative impact reshapes entire sectors. This is how geopolitical change actually occurs, not through declarations, but through decisions made under uncertainty. For Canada, the gamble is significant. Standing firm could invite retaliation or strain relations. But capitulating could lock the country into a subordinate role just as the global system becomes more competitive. The choice, therefore, is existential, and it reflects a broader realization. In a world defined by strategic rivalry, neutrality is rare, but agency is possible. Canada's assertion of agency sends a message that resonates far beyond aluminium. It signals that economic sovereignty is no longer negotiable by default. It must be respected. This message is being heard. Emerging economies, resource-rich states, and technologically advanced middle powers are watching closely. They see in Canada's stance a potential blueprint, cautious, lawful, alliance-aware, yet firm. If successful, This approach could redefine how power is distributed in the 21st century, not through confrontation but through refusal. Refusal to accept asymmetry, refusal to absorb disproportionate risk, refusal to surrender strategic capacity for short-term stability. Yet the story is not over, because resistance alone does not determine outcomes. What matters is how the other side responds and how both adapt to the new equilibrium taking shape. As negotiations continue and positions harden, the coming months will reveal whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point.